So hello and welcome back to Books and Things. Now today I have two books I want to speak to you about. Two books that I would like to speak about in a comparative way. So the two books I want to talk to you about are both short story collections, and they're both short story collections that are inspired by the works of various Bronte sisters. So the first book I want to speak to you about is Read I Married Him, which has been edited by Tracy Chevalier. Now I've heard a lot about this book on BookTube and on the internet and everywhere. It has been pretty big and I felt quite disappointed by this book, as I think quite a lot of people on BookTube did. So I wanted to do a video explaining why I felt a bit disappointed with this book and also talking about this book. Now this book is The Red Room, short stories inspired by the Bronte sisters. This I read about 18 months ago and I have heard very little about this book. This is a very, very underhyped book. I think it has 11 ratings on Goodreads, but I really do think that if you read Read I Married Him and were disappointed by it, then The Red Room may be exactly what you are looking for. I wanted to start by talking about Read I Married Him, this collection. As I said, I have heard a lot about this. It has had quite a lot of hype in the media and on BookTube, although the hype on BookTube is more like it's been talked about a lot than people have actually enjoyed it. Most people I have seen talking about this have said they were disappointed by it. And the reason why a lot of people have said they felt disappointed with this was because they felt that a lot of the stories didn't really feel like they were inspired by Jane Eyre. Now I have two main complaints about this book, and one of them is that I had heard people on BookTube say that the stories weren't very inspired by Jane Eyre, so I was kind of expecting them to not be hugely inspired by Jane Eyre, but I was still disappointed because I didn't realise quite how little most of the stories have to do with Jane Eyre at all. There are 21 stories in this book. I would say about 5 are inspired by Jane Eyre. The rest are inspired by the line Read I Married Him, which is a line from Jane Eyre, but that is where it ends. In fact, a lot of them aren't even inspired by the line Read I Married Him, they're just inspired by ideas and the theme of marriage. I buddy read Read I Married Him with Liz from Now Voyaging, I'll link her channel down below, and we read a story a day and discussed them, and one thing we were saying to each other every day was, I've given up on finding the Jane Eyre connection. There's no Jane Eyre connection. Where is the Jane Eyre connection? And it's not there. But it's not just that I wanted the stories to be more to do with Jane Eyre and they weren't more to do with Jane Eyre. It's also that because most of the stories aren't inspired by Jane Eyre, they just don't hang together as a collection. Like, there are 5 or 6, as I said, that are inspired by Jane Eyre and that are very strongly inspired by Jane Eyre, where you can really see the connection. For example, Tracy Chevalier's Dorset Gap is a beautiful story, and it takes 2 characters, one is called Jen and one is called Ed, and you can kind of see the Jane Edward Rochester link between them. Jen is reading Jane Eyre and you can see the connection to Jane Eyre. And then we have The Orphan Exchange by Audrey Nifflinger, which was my favourite story in this collection, which takes a situation and some characters in Jane Eyre and translates it into an entirely different historical setting. And there are moments where the character who is the equivalent of Jane Eyre and the character who is the equivalent of Helen Burns have conversations that Jane and Helen have in Jane Eyre, but they're slightly different. And that is so rewarding and so wonderful, and that is what I wanted from all of this book, and I kind of only got it in that one story. And I find it very interesting that the Tracy Chevalier story in this book was inspired by Jane Eyre, and you can tell it's inspired by Jane Eyre, whereas so many of the other stories were clearly not inspired by Jane Eyre very much. They were inspired by the sentence Read I Married Him, and because this is edited by Tracy Chevalier, it does make me think that maybe she had a slightly different idea of the book than what actually happened. But because some of the stories are clearly inspired by Jane Eyre, and some of the stories are clearly inspired by the line Read I Married Him, and some of the stories seem to have nothing to do with either, it feels like what happened was someone had the idea for this book, maybe Tracy Chevalier, I don't know, and they put out requests to all of these authors, and half of the authors, or maybe a third, maybe even a quarter of the authors wrote stories especially for the book, and the others had a look through short stories they had previously written and thought, well, that's kind of about marriage, that'll do, and sent it in. That is what it feels like. It just doesn't hang together as a collection because it feels like every single author was working to a completely different brief. So that is my first complaint, or possibly my first 2. 1, that it just doesn't hang together as a collection, and 2, that it was wrongly marketed. Read I Married Him, stories inspired by Jane Eyre. No, it should be like Read I Married Him, an anthology or something. You could kind of make the argument that they're all inspired by the line Read I Married Him, but I don't think you can make the argument that they're all inspired by Jane Eyre. I was reading the contributor notes in the back of the book, and one of the authors who has a story in here hasn't even read Jane Eyre, so she definitely can't claim that her story has been inspired by Jane Eyre because she hasn't read the book. And the second complaint is that I just didn't like a lot of the stories, and there are some stories in here that I would say are like 5-star reads for me. I really liked My Mother's Wedding by Tessa Hadley. I really loved Since I First Saw Your Face by Emma Donoghue, which was wonderful and reminds me that I need to read more Emma Donoghue. I really loved Dorset Gap by Tracy Chevalier. I thought The Orphan Exchange by Audrey Niffenegger was absolutely brilliant, and I really enjoyed Robinson Crusoe at the Water Park by Elizabeth McCracken as well. So there are some stories that I loved in here that I would give like 5 stars to on their own, but the majority of the stories I would have given like 1 star to and can't even remember. A lot of the stories in here felt for me just like they weren't short stories. They didn't work as short stories. They felt like they didn't quite hang together as a coherent thing. You know, for quite a lot of these stories, they really felt like they were written by novelists who don't write short stories very often. A lot of them felt like they were kind of synopses from novels. A lot of the stories for me had quite a kind of boring, bland writing style. And in a novel, if the characters are really good or the plot is really good, then I can kind of forgive it kind of mediocre, ordinary writing. But for short stories, for me, the writing is so important. And throughout this collection, I was longing for short stories that did something slightly more interesting with writing. It wasn't just that the stories weren't connected to Jane Eyre enough for me, it was also just that the stories weren't that good. So yes, I was not overly impressed by this, and I was quite disappointed with it. However, if you read this and you were disappointed, I think you should read this. I really, really do. So this is a collection of short stories inspired by the Bronte sisters, and this was published in 2013 by Unthanked Books. As I said, this is very underhyped. This has not had the marketing and publicity of Reader, I Married Him. The writers who have contributed to this are not big names in the way that the writers of Reader, I Married Him are. Most of them you might not have heard of, and part of the reason why is because they're all primarily short story writers more than novelists, which means that their short stories are actually short stories. I think this is a brilliant collection. I read it 18 months ago, I gave it 5 stars. I think there are some incredible stories in here. This collection has 12 stories. They're not just inspired by Jane Eyre, they're inspired by the novels of all 3 Bronte sisters, and quite a lot of them are inspired by Wuthering Heights. But it's so good, and I really think that if you were disappointed by Reader, I Married Him, you would enjoy this, because it's just done so well, and you can feel the love for the Brontes' writing, and you can feel the interest in the Brontes' writing and the desire to take the Brontes' writing and do something slightly different with them and to play with the ideas of these books. It just feels properly inspired by the Brontes in a wonderful way, and I also think the stories are of a much higher quality than the majority of stories in Reader, I Married Him. The stories in here are very good, they're very interesting, they're very different, they do interesting things with writing and plot and structure, and they vary, and it's just a wonderful collection. We have Ashton and Elaine by David Constantine, which is a short story which takes these 2 children who kind of end up being foster brother and sister, who have a relationship a little bit like Cathy and Heathcliff, and it examines that relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff in a very different way, in a very different setting, in a very different environment. We have Rowena MacDonald's A Child of Pleasure, which is my favourite story in the whole collection, which takes a relationship from Villette, the relationship between Lucy Snow and a student at the school Lucy teaches at called Ginevra Fanshawe, and it updates this relationship into the modern day, into the relationship of someone tutoring a young, very spoilt girl, and it does something slightly different with their relationship and really examines the way in which Charlotte Bronte portrays Ginevra Fanshawe in Villette. It's absolutely brilliant, so wonderful, my favourite in this book. We have Vanessa Gebbie's Chapter 38, in which she takes the final chapter of Jane Eyre and rewrites it to give the book a rather different ending, and it's pretty wonderful. We have Elizabeth Baines' This Turbulent Stillness, which is a wonderful story. I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Baines. I've read one of her short story collections since then, and I think she's a wonderful writer who does very interesting things with form and structure. We have a central heroine who really loves the Bronte sisters, and her kind of ambition in life is to be a Bronte heroine, and because she is so intent on these ideas of romanticism, she ends up in a relationship with a guy who is not very good for her and is not very nice, in a slightly Heathcliff manner. We also have My Dear Miss by Zoe King, which is set up as Jane Eyre writing letters to an agony aunt, but the agony aunt is not any agony aunt, she is Emma Woodhouse from Jane Austen's Emma. It's hilarious and brilliant. Or we have Bill Brodie's Heathcliff versus Sherlock Holmes, which is about 2 people going on a date and having a big argument about who is better, Heathcliff or Sherlock Holmes, and quite a few others. There are just so many wonderful stories in here that do such interesting thing with the source materials of the Brontes' works and the Brontes themselves as people, and it's wonderful. And it really, you feel the love of the Brontes' works throughout this collection in such a wonderful way. Now, another thing I really love about the Red Room is that in the back of the book, it has a section called Inspirations, where each of the authors write a paragraph or a few lines about why they wrote this story and what in the Brontes' works inspired them. And I loved that. And I really felt that was lacking in Reader, I Married Him. And in general, I don't necessarily want to know about an author's inspirations. I don't feel the need to have that in other short story collections. But I feel that when you have a short story collection that is inspired by another body of work, it's really fascinating to read about how that one thing spawned this other thing. And I love in the Red Room that you get this sense of where all these stories came from and how these writers were inspired by the Brontes and their feelings about the Brontes. I think that's really wonderful, especially for some of the stories that feel slightly less immediately tied to the Brontes. And that aspect of this is really nice. And I could have done with that in Reader, I Married Him. I really could have done. Because so many of these stories for me felt like they were not remotely inspired by Jane Eyre and felt like they were just shoehorned into this collection. I feel like if there had been a bit at the back of the book where each of the authors had explained why they feel that Jane Eyre and their story are tied to one another, if they had said, I wanted to explore this theme that I feel is important in Jane Eyre, or I wanted to look at marriage in this way because of this that happens in Jane Eyre, then maybe I would have got it, and maybe they would have felt like they fitted together. It would have been great just to know a little bit more about why these authors feel that these stories are inspired by Jane Eyre, when for the most part I don't feel like they are. When a short story collection is inspired by something else, it's not just a short story collection, it's also a response to that other piece of work, and it's nice to find out where that response came from. So that is another thing I really love about the Red Room. I think that is all I wanted to say. I'm sorry for the rant against Reader, I Married Him. It's not that I hated reading it, like quite a lot of the stories I did enjoy, but I'm annoyed because I feel it could have been something else and it could have been something wonderful, and it isn't that wonderful thing that I would have liked it to be. But if you also feel that it wasn't that wonderful thing that you wanted it to be, or if you are concerned that it will not be that wonderful thing you want it to be, please read The Red Room. It is so good, and it is so much better than Reader, I Married Him. It is done a great deal better, the premise is pulled off so much better, the stories are in general of a higher quality, and this feels like the work of people who love the Brontes. Reader, I Married Him doesn't. And that, I think, for me, is where it fell down, because I love the Brontes. I think that is all I had to say. I was disappointed with Reader, I Married Him, because it could have been much better. Anyway, that is all I have to say for now. I'll be back very soon with another video. In the meantime, happy reading, and yeah, let me know if you have read either of these books and what you thought of them. I'll see you very soon.